state before we start that it is an honor to be part of the BGS event series and especially to have the opportunity to talk to our guest speakers about some of the exciting changes that are happening in energy regulation in Chile right now. So first, I want to thank Gabriela, Fernanda, Marcelo, and Gonzalo for our speakers for being here today to discuss these regulatory innovations and share your thoughts on how they may impact the market. And before we start with the presentations, I just want to take 1 minute to introduce myself. I'm a Chilean attorney specialized in public law. I graduated from the LLM in Berkeley in 2018, and I just finished my master's in public policy at the Goldman School, also at UC Berkeley. I returned to Chile after studying and working for 3 years in the Bay Area and founded the LMP Group. It's a law firm that brings together highly trained professionals in different areas with the aim to provide legal advice and public consultancy in different policy matters. But I don't want to talk more about me because we're all here to hear from our speakers. So let's dive in. And I just want to share with you what's our agenda for today. So Gabriela and Fernanda will start and talk about reforms to the distribution sector and the introduction of competition in retail energy markets. And after that, Gonzalo and Marcelo will share perspectives on competition and investment in the transmission sector, the expectations for the first HVDC line in Chile, and the lessons learned from Cardones Polpaico, a line that was planned before the reforms that were introduced in 2016 to the transmission sector. Before each block, I will give a bit of context to allow our international attendees to jump into our speakers' thoughts and ideas without the need to stop in the details of Chilean and specific policy initiatives. And at the very end of the presentations, we will have time for questions from the public, but we encourage you to write them all down in the chat as the presentations take place. So please let me know if I'm speaking too fast. I tend to do that. So before Gabriela and Fernanda's presentation, I would like to share very briefly with the audience what's happening in Chile's distribution sector. So the distribution sector remained mostly unchanged since the enactment of the Electricity Services Act in 1982. In that opportunity, Congress decided to open up the generation sector to competition, but that was not true for the transmission and distribution sectors, which remain highly regulated as natural monopolies. Distribution companies ended up in charge both of operating the distribution systems and also of selling energy to final users. However, motivated by technology advancement and the regulatory tendencies in other reference markets worldwide, such as California, the UK, Australia, and Spain, in 2016, the government started a structural reform process for the distribution sector. The first step was taken 1 year ago when Congress passed an act that reduced distribution companies' profitability and enhanced the rate-making process. And in mid-2020, the Ministry of Energy decided to tackle this structural reform through 3 bills of law. The first one is the Portability Bill, which is currently being discussed in Congress. And also there's the Quality of Service Bill and the Distributed Energy Resources Bill. The two latter are expected to go into Congress in the following months. So there's a lot going on nowadays in this sector. Let me tell you a bit about the contents of the Portability Act because Fernanda and Gabriela are going to be focusing on that. The Portability Bill proposes the separation of distribution from potentially competitive activities in the energy markets, such as the provision of energy efficiency services, the incorporation of distributed energy resources, digital energy services, energy storage, residential generation, among others. And for doing so, the bill introduces what is called the electricity retailers. So the idea is that these retailers will act under competitive conditions, separating infrastructural operation and development activities from retail energy markets and the energy sale to final users. And one of the key ideas of the bill is that every user will have the right to choose the retailer, which explains the name of the act, right? It's called the Portability Act. Also, the introduction of these retailers goes hand in hand with the flexibilization of tender processes for the subscription of energy supply contracts. So the Energy Authority will seek to allocate short, medium, and long-term contracts to build the optimum portfolio for final uses. And finally, the bill also creates the Data Hub, which is an independent actor both from government and companies that will guarantee transparency and access neutrality to relevant market data, reducing the asymmetry of information, all necessary to enable competition in this sector. So with that being said, please let me introduce you to Gabriela Manriquez. Gabriela has more than 6 years of experience in regulated markets, competition law, and energy regulation. She graduated from Universidad de Chile School of Law, and afterwards she earned a certificate in economy and finance from the School of Economics and Business at the same university. Gabriela currently works in the National Energy Commission in Chile, and she has been part of various teams that have developed and implemented the latest regulatory modifications to the energy sector, including the distribution reform and residential energy transition plan. Previously, she worked at the Energy Markets Department at the Ministry of Energy and was part of the antitrust team at Kerry, one of the largest law firms in Chile. So thank you, Gabriela, for being here today. And please, the scenario is all yours.
So I'm sharing my screen right now. Can you see it properly? Okay, great. So hi, good afternoon to everyone, and special thanks to Berkeley Global Society for organizing this web conference. I am actually delighted to be part of this really good panel with really good professionals. And thank you, Camila, as well, for that really kind introduction. So we're here to discuss some regulatory innovation for the energy market, the opportunities that lay beyond for investment, and of course the challenges that arise because of this to introduce competition in the context that Camila described very well. So to make this discussion a bit simpler, I have divided the presentation in three main topics. The main issues we need to look into as regulators and that must be addressed separately for the sake of the discussion, of course. So as you can see here, the main topics that I will address right now are the current legal market structure, also the concentration of regulated markets, and at last, the future competitive markets. Then I think this one might be the most interesting one because it will link very well, I hope, with Fernanda's presentation afterwards. So the first one, as I said, is the current state of regulation of our electric market in Chile. We have one specific article in the Electricity Act that recognizes three main markets. These are transmission, distribution, and generation. So in doing so, this regulation actually seeks to avoid vertical integration among these three segments. Here in this slide, you can see the interaction among these segments. So according to the discussion that was set in the Congress on 2004 when this bill passed, the goal behind this structure was to ensure the development of the generation market under competitive conditions that actually weren't possible at that time under the other market structure that was a fully integrated company that owned the assets in all the industrial chain. So the standard set by the regulator in order to achieve this goal was as you can see here in the triangle. The transmission segment, or any company or business group with assets in this segment, can't currently participate in the generation or distribution segments, like by any means. Also here, the generation and the distribution companies or companies or economic groups that have assets in these segments are allowed only to participate up to, or to have only up to 8% of the market share individually, and jointly 40% in the transmission market. There's no restriction set to participate between distribution and generation. Also, this regulation does not address this little triangle that you can see here at the end of the slide. This little triangle will go further into it in the third section when we talk about new markets competition. But here I just wanted to show that actually the relation between both triangles is not that far, because here you have a network and then you have two other segments that need that network to function. And then in the distribution segment, we will have the same relation, one network, and then other markets that need that network to give their services to the final consumers. So it is also important to notice that there you can see the investment timing. So what does this mean? It's actually, it makes no sense for me, and that's why I'm sharing with you here right now, is that it's important to notice that the way in which the regulation is constructed, it depends on which market you invest first. So if you start your investment in generation, then you will be allowed to have up to 8% of market share in transmission. But if you start your investment in transmission, then you won't be able to invest in generation. The same example applies actually to distribution and transmission, the interaction among those two markets. So how has it worked so far? So after 16 years, I think it's fair to ask ourselves if the regulation has worked so far. So we could say that actually the first decade was kind of a successful one, because jointly with the tender offers for regulated clients, it allowed for the generation market to develop in a fairly competitive environment. What does this mean? That actually currently in the generation market, there are a lot of companies that are currently providing the service. So, but what happened next? We've had this regulation for 16 years. So what has happened is that 4 years ago, in 2016, this is something that Marcelo will probably address so much better than me in his presentation, but in 2016, there was a new bill that was mainly addressing the transmission market, and it included many new elements that also needs to be taken into account in this discussion. For example, the planning for the new infrastructure is now centralized. Also, it was the introduction and creation of our independent system operator. The regulation of the tariffs has been improved, and also the regulation for open access to a network was improved as well. So I think these four elements are something really important to take into account when we talk about how the ownership of transmission network affects into competitive markets that are downwards. That's why I'm mentioning them. So right now it's possible to actually see that Article 7, it's a static regulation that sets very strict standards, and it's trying to influence what happens in really dynamic markets. So actually the mergers and acquisitions that have happened in the electricity sector for the last years have shown us how fast this can actually happen. Also, the limits are really unclear and difficult to apply. As I told you, it's 8% individually and 40% jointly, but over what? Does the shares in a company apply proportionally to the market share of that company in the whole market? So there hasn't been any interpretation or under regulation that give us answers to this question. Also, the competition authorities' deference towards the energy regulator is something we should look into. So if the regulation goal, as I told you in the beginning, was to allow competition, then why do competition authorities allow merger operations, saying that the application of the energy regulation is competence of the energy enforcement agents? This is a really interesting question because we have had two mergers that were highly discussed in the public in the energy sector, to big acquisitions that, according to the FNE, weren't actually complying with Article 7, but they say they wouldn't see any competition issues there. So in my opinion, this happens because the merger control procedure, that is also new, it's from 2017, has actually better tools to assess if a merger or acquisition that involves these three markets can actually represent a problem for competition. So when it doesn't, this Article 7 is obsolete because it presumes that over the passing limits actually represent some kind of inexistent risk. Also, another thing we should address, I think, is that enforcement tools and legal sanctions are not consistent with the goals behind the regulation. The agency that should enforce and apply sanctions when companies aren't complying can even order asset divestment or influence the merger control analysis done by the competition authorities. So, is it actually a competition or a regulatory problem? In my opinion, it appears to clearly be a competition problem that it's addressed by a regulation that it's not working according to the goal, or new regulation in transmission and merger control make this really worth revising. So what can we do? What are our regulatory alternatives? I think, and actually it's been in the press lately, if someone has been following Chilean press, you can see that there has been a lot of discussion about this. The first one is to allow vertical integration among transmission and distribution, because there are a lot of efficiencies due to economies of scope. Restrictions are difficult to justify in competition risks since they're both natural monopolies. Also, the constraint for vertical integration among transmission and generation should be symmetric at least. With this, I mean this constraint that applies depending in which market you invest first shouldn't be applicable. So it makes no sense that if you invest first in generation, then you can invest in transmission up to 8%. But if you start your investments in Chile in transmission, then you can't ever invest in generation. It makes absolutely no sense. So as I've said, I think it's actually a competition problem, and constraint in this regard should be flexible and defined by the competition authorities, not by the electric regulator. Also, we need, and this is something obvious for a regulation of this entity, is that the revision of compliance should be dynamic, and also that the penalties that are designed in the regulation must be according to the goals that are set in that regulation. So here it would be advisable to have something like asset divestment that the SEC could apply. So that was the first part. Now I'm going to address other problem, that it's actually concentration in regulated markets. This one is actually a regulatory problem and not a competition one. So I feel a bit more comfortable talking about it. So what's the context behind this discussion? There's been an international tendency towards market concentration in the last years. A lot of purchase power has been acquiring companies, and some of these are huge economic groups, and in some cases these huge economic groups are backed by states. So does this represent any kind of risk? I think it does, and in fact some countries make analyses that include national security, others regulatory aspects, others both. In Chile, we have actually relied in our competition authorities through the merger control revision, but there is actually no specific tool or regulation that address this issue. Why is this important? Because we're in presence with these markets, especially transmission and distribution, these are natural monopolies, right? So this means that the most efficient number of firms is one, And because of the existence of economies of scale and scope, actually one firm can provide a service or good at a lowest cost. So here it's another really interesting thing, that if the regulator could transfer all those efficiencies to final customers, the existence of only one firm would be actually desirable, right? But regulation has its own challenges as well. So the existence of only one firm could actually exacerbate issues such as capture and information asymmetry. Here you can see that it's possible to see risks in transmission and distribution, but they're all mainly regarding the increase of information asymmetries, regulatory capture, and operational hazards of the companies. A couple of years ago, distribution utility in Chile had a problem with the SIP software, and then all the clients have really bad problems with the invoices. So this could actually happen in a national level if we accept that only one company gives the distribution service everywhere. So here we have different alternatives as well. We could make a legal constraints, such as the ones that impede the more of 8% of participation in generation or distribution, or actually we could have some kind of case review by the different institutions that currently exist in Chile. We could also create a ministry council that can address all these issues. But here I'm just gonna address some of the ideas that have been in the press for the last weeks due to the acquisition of TGE, that's a huge distribution utility company, for State Grid, that it's a China state-owned company. So here, through the alternatives that have been into discussion, we see that the competition authorities could do this review in the merger control procedure, but it is actually not a competition problem. So even though it's really tempting to use the merger control procedure to address this issue, it's actually really inappropriate in terms of competence and institutional and the ways institution works, because this is not a competition problem. Also, the House of Representatives or Congress last week, they presented a bill saying that they should be the ones, the members of the House of the Representatives should be the ones to address this and accept if they wanted actually international investment or not in Chile. But I think this is also a really bad idea because it is not a political issue, and there's obviously a lack of technical expertise that can't be overpassed. Maybe this could be an option if we would be talking about national security issues, but the scope of this presentation, it's actually the regulatory issues due to mergers. So I think this isn't appropriate either. Also, the idea of the Ministry Council, that it has happened in Chile through the environmental analysis, but the experience is not that good. There are good cases. Maybe Gonzalo will address this later in his presentation, but the contingencies actually, after going through the Ministry Council, go into the judiciary system, and then it turns a technical and political discussion into a legal matter. So I think this wouldn't be really appropriate either. Finally, there's the regulatory control. It's in red because it's the ones that I like the most. That actually the regulator should be the one to analyze the risks of mergers in regulated markets. There could also be a revision afterwards by the panel of experts. That's a really respected institution among the electricity sector in Chile. And this ensures two things that, in my opinion, are really important, that are transparency and merits of the decisions. So we've reached the third main topic. I think that this topic it's really interesting because after seeing the first two issues, it is actually fair to make us this question: is competition a real possibility in the electricity market in Chile? So the context, as Camila said before, is that a bill for the distribution market is currently being discussed at Congress. And this bill pretends to separate the natural monopoly or network market from all those ones that can actually be competitive, or mainly the electricity retail market. So considering that, I think it's fair to discuss the challenges or difficulties that these new markets will face. Mainly, I see the ones that you can see in the slide that are the competitive advantages and market dominance that the utility companies have over other companies that want to enter the market. The strategic assets here are the network and the information for the final customers. And the relevant markets, are mainly electricity retail, distributed energy resources, and some energy efficiency, among others. So what are the specific risks and its sources? So here we have that the utilities have secure income. So this could represent a risk regarding cross-subsidy among regulated income and competitive income. This actually gives incentives for predatory prices in competitive markets. Also, regarding the information, they have preferential access to customer data, so they can actually present target supply for specific demands. And this is really interesting for the final users, for us, the customers that will access this kind of supply, but it's actually really bad for other competitors that don't have access to that information. And the other two that are mostly related are service quality and network access, in which the operator of the network is not independent. So the distribution company, the utility, can operate the network in a way that will be better for its own clients. Also, they have preferential knowledge of the network conditions and access to the network. So if they want to connect a distributed energy resource, they know exactly where it's better for the resource to be connected and where the network's conditions are better for it to operate. And also the decisions on network development belong to them. So if they want to install a distributed energy resource in some place of the city, then they will have the ability to expand the network toward that specific place. So to address the problem of information, as Camila said in the presentation, the bill actually has a new institution, that's the Data Hub. That some of its main characteristics are that it will be independent. Also, it will be exclusive. This means that they cannot, the company or economic groups that provide these services cannot have any other activities in the energy sector in Chile, and it will be assigned through a bidding process. So what are the alternatives that we have for these markets to develop, considering the risks that were identified? First, the one that was related to secure income, for the possibility of predatory prices. This was actually addressed in the distribution bill of 2019 that I was honored to participate in. So there we established that a utility can only provide tariff services. So the income they receive can only be used to provide the service that is considered under the tariff process. Then for the information problem, we have the Data Hub. So it's actually a temporary constraint on the electricity market that will be overcome after 4 years. That it's more or less the time that it takes for the Data Hub to be operating. And regarding service quality and network access, these are actually more structural, and I think this actually deserves a little look into consideration, and maybe in the bill we should put some restrictions for the utility to participate in these other markets. So here I wanted to share some final remarks with you. So in the first issue that we addressed, the one from current industry structure, I think that we really need an update to be consistent with the new regulation and with the and with the challenges that the new decades presents to us. We also need to address the new markets that are going to enter. So it's not possible to remain with a regulation that doesn't address problems and that's actually obsolete regarding problems that are coming. In the second hand, the concentration in natural monopolies might be risky. It actually may be really risky for regulatory purposes, but a merger control with focus on such risks might be reasonable and a good alternative to mitigate these effects in the energy markets, and mainly because of the regulation problems that arise from these concentrations. And finally, the distribution utilities do have some important competitive advantages that justify structural constraints, at least in the first years of market development for the electricity retail market, and permanent but flexible for the distributed energy resources market. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and Camila, you can go back.
Thank you, Gabriela. It was a really interesting presentation. I particularly love how you present alternatives and solution and address like the pros and cons of each of those policy alternatives presented. I think that's a real contribution to the discussion. A lot of times we see just the discussion is kind of narrow in scope, and it's just great to hear some other perspectives. And of course, I'm sure that the audience, just like me, has a lot of questions. But again, I wanted to remind you that you can write down your questions in the chat, and we will address them at the very end of the presentations. And I just want to move on to Fernanda's presentation. So let me introduce her to you. Fernanda Riveros, she's a lawyer, a master's in regulation from the London School of Economics, with more than 6 years of experience in energy market. She's currently finishing a master's in European and International Energy Law at TU Berlin. Fernanda leads the energy team at LMP law firm, and she's a partner at eFirm Consulting. And before moving to London and Berlin, Fernanda worked as a legal advisor for the Ministry of Energy in Chile. So thank you, Fernanda, for being here today, and we're ready for you.
Thank you, Camila. Let me share the presentation. Can you see it properly? Okay. Thank you very much, Camila, for the presentation and the introduction, and thanks to Berkeley Global Society for organizing this panel and for giving us the opportunity to share and to learn from each other's experiences. I very much look forward for the debate afterward. So let's begin. So if we are talking about regulatory innovation in the in the electricity sector in general, we cannot miss what is happening in the distribution sector, and especially in the reform that the government is currently promoting. So I'm going to analyze some key aspects of this reform and its consequences and implications. So very briefly, this is the structure of my presentation. First, I'm going to give some key ideas about the reform. Then I'm going to go to talk about the new and changing role for distribution companies and the new platform for energy services around the distribution networks. Then I will give a brief overview of the new players coming into the market. And finally, I'm going to talk about emerging market trends in the electricity sector and some final comments. So, as Camila has already mentioned, this long-awaited reform began its processing in the Congress in September this year, and some general ideas about the reform. It generally follows international regulatory trends, deregulating certain segments of the supply chain. The reform basically proposes the separation of distribution network infrastructure from retailing activities and from, as Gabriela also mentioned, some other activities around the distribution networks. These reforms also considers the scenario of energy transition and decentralization of energy resources and the need to decarbonize the energy mix, with the consequent also need to incorporate rapidly renewable energies and distributed energy resources in an efficient manner. The reform also acknowledges this new idea and this new role for energy consumers as active consumers or prosumers, who can consume and produce energy at the same time. And it also aims to achieve competitive conditions for creating these new markets and introducing new players into the electricity sector. So this reform will have important consequences for the distribution sector, specifically changing the role for DSOs. Today in Chile, we have 4 large distribution companies operating in Chile, serving roughly 95% of the almost 7 million regulated users. And the remaining share corresponds to local and small distribution companies and small electricity cooperatives. So basically, the bill incorporates one of the major regulatory changes, unbundling distribution network activities due to their natural monopoly characteristics from those potentially competitive ones and segments of the chain. I think some microphones are not muted.
I just muted it. Yeah.
Okay. So according to what Gabriela mentioned before, the purpose of the bill is to generate competitive conditions in this new market created across the distribution network in order to allow the entry of new competitors and new players. Currently, many of these potentially competitive activities are provided exclusively by the distribution companies. For example, selling energy to small residential consumers, and certain activities that, although are not exclusively provided by distribution companies, are mostly provided by them due to entry barriers or information or asymmetries of information. So this new scenario implies an important change in the role for distribution companies, now acting as neutral market facilitators. And this new role stems basically from 2 types or sources of change. First, we have regulatory changes, as mentioned and very repeated now, the separation of network activities from potentially competitive ones, especially retailing activities, and the incorporation of this new obligation for DSOs to carry out annual distribution planning processes with the participation of stakeholders, mainly distributed energy resources developers. Regarding systemic change, we have the transformation of the power sector with decentralization of energy resources, growing introduction of distributed energy resources, reverse flows of power, and the need to manage congestions. And finally, the changing, and also already mentioned, the changing customer needs and roles of consumers as prosumers. So the reform and the new market trends will certainly create a new platform for the development of energy services around the distribution network and the introduction of new players. As can be seen in the figure, the distribution company now will play a role of neutral infrastructure facilitator, and multiple actors can intervene around the distribution network, such as, for example, demand aggregators, energy services providers, such as energy efficiency, distributed energy resources providers, aggregators, and distribution services providers, such as the connection market that I'm going to refer later. In this sense, it's important to ensure that the distribution company play a role as neutral market facilitator, ensuring third-party access to networks, and by the other hand, the important role that the data hub will play in terms of providing adequate information and avoiding asymmetries of information. Due to time constraints, I can only refer briefly to the most important players in this new market. So firstly, we need to start with the supplier or retailer. As you may all know, the first liberalization processes of retail energy markets began in the late 1990s in the UK and Norway. And in the Latin American region, Colombia is the only country that has liberalized this segment, although the residential tariffs are still regulated. In simple terms, the bill incorporates the right for all users, including small residential consumers, to choose their supplier. And this is the main slogan of the government and the Portability Bill, or Electricity Portability Bill, that is like the right to choose their own supplier. The current regime, these consumers are supplied by distribution companies operating in the concession area, acting as a monopoly energy supplier. By the other hand, this model proposes a hybrid model because although competition is introduced, price formation will maintain a highly regulated company due to the maintenance of supply tenders carried out by the regulator. So at this point, it should be noted that the bill considers the coexistence of two types of supplier. First, we have the regulated supplier, and then we have the non-regulated or free supplier. With regard to regulated supplier, it will be up to the distribution company to undertake these activities. And in simple terms, it will work in a similar manner than the current distribution regime, with distribution companies offering regulated tariffs, considering these price setting processes. By the other hand, we have the non-regulated suppliers who will have to submit the licensing regime, and the regulator will authorize the entry of the suppliers and the authorizations. Then we have the distribution services providers. This is not properly a new agent or a new player in the market because the current regime already incorporates the possibility for these services to be provided by third parties. These services are linked to the distribution of electricity, such as, for example, connections, meters, and public lighting. The general rule is that these services are market-based priced, although some and the most important services are subject to price setting processes. In international, in markets of reference, we have the competition in connection markets in place in the United Kingdom since early 2000s. There you have independent connection providers that can compete freely with distribution companies to complete some connection activities. This market is really important in the United Kingdom and moves around £500 million per year. Then we have the aggregator of distributed energy resources. Although the final text of the Distributed Energy Resources Bill is not yet available, the regulator already advanced that an explicit definition for this concept will be included, and is basically installations capable of generating, injecting, or storing electrical energy connected to a distribution system. There we have, for example, electric vehicles, residential generation and demand aggregation, and storage behind the meter solutions. Basically, their aggregator is a company that operates a virtual power plant, which aggregate dispersed theirs with the aim to provide services to the grid. Some ongoing initiatives and successful initiatives. On the left hand, we have the virtual power plant that currently Tesla and the Australian government is deploying in South Australia. This plant comprises almost 50,000 household solar units that will have an installed capacity of roughly 250 megas. So it's quite a big plant. And on the right hand, we have the STEM, that is a California-based startup that uses artificial intelligence to manage energy storage solutions and virtual power plants. So in regard to the emerging market trends in the market, we can see that big players in the national energy market are already taking their first steps into these new markets that are being driven by both the reform and the power transformation, the transformation of the power sector. As an example, we have the case of Copec, the main fuel distribution company that in 2019 began its acquisition process to consolidate its energy intelligence area, incorporating companies from different domains, such as, for example, suppliers, electromobility solutions, distributed energy resources developers, and is particularly noteworthy the international developments, such as the signing of a joint venture with the recently mentioned STEM company, and then the acquisition of Ampere, a Spanish battery developer. Likewise, we have traditional players in the electricity sector, including generation, transmission, and distribution companies that are exploring alternatives in this new market that will be boosted by the reform. So some final comments to close my presentation. I think it's worth to assess the regulatory model in terms of how effective is in creating real incentives for innovation, such as the introduction of distributed energy resources, and to improve the quality of service and the experience of end customers. Also, as Gabriela mentioned, the situation of competition and the prohibition of unbundle incorporated in the Article 7 is still uncertain, and many discussions are taking place around that topic. And the outcomes of that regulatory process will have huge impact in this new market. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Finally, also there's a huge issue regarding the gap that Chile faces in terms of digitalization. As an example, smart meter penetration in China and in the US is roughly 70% and 44% in the European Union. And in Chile is roughly 5%. So still we have a huge gap to close. There's also, and this is really well addressed in the bill of distributed energy resources, there is a need to incorporate more public participation in the process in general, especially mainly due to the massive incorporation of distributed energy resources. So there is in that line, international experience shows that stakeholder participation is essential in the distribution planning process. And finally, also there is a kind of consensus in the need to moderate expectations regarding the impact of the reform in terms of final prices for consumers. International evidence, especially the experience of the United Kingdom, shows that the benefits to the consumers in terms of lower prices is highly dubious, and that there is a strong inertia in consumers who do not change supplier, especially the most vulnerable customers, as like less educated people and people with less resources. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'm really much looking forward for the debate afterwards. So I'm giving back the...
Thank you, Fernanda. That was a really interesting presentation. It's incredible how much like this reform gives us to talk about. There's so many details and opportunities, and the fun part is that everyone is seeing it with a lot of hope and expectation, but at the same time there's a lot of details, I think, and I think that you just made it clear in the design and the implementation of the reform that are going to determine its success. So I'm also looking forward to the questions from the public or the debate between the speakers. I think that's going to be great. But okay, so now we must jump into the transmission world. So, as I said, Marcelo and Gonzalo will share their perspectives for competition and investment in the transmission market, drawing from current and past experiences. So again, I'm gonna give you a bit of context before introducing our expert speakers. So the transmission sector was reformed in 2016. As Gabriela said, the most important change for the conversation that we're having today was the introduction of long-term 30-year strategic planning, which has to be done every 5 years in order to determine the extension of the works that are needed for the grid. And the aim is to always to promote economic efficiency, competition, safety, and diversification. The reform also incorporated mandatory citizen participation, a preliminary siting study subject to prior consultation, and an environmental assessment regarding the projected expansion works. In October 2020, pretty recently, the government opened an international tender process for the first HVDC line in Chile with an extension of 1,500 kilometers. According to the calendar, it should be finalized in October 2021, and there are already more than 60 companies interested in the process. Why is this project so important? The idea is that this project will connect the north with the center of the country to transport energy, mainly solar and wind, from multiple generation projects owned by different developers, operating in parallel to the current AC system. And it is expected that this power line will make it possible to integrate large volumes of energy generated by renewable sources, make the decarbonization process viable, and create a more robust and resilient national grid in the face of the possible effects of climate change that we're experiencing all around the world. So, well, with no longer ado, I would like to introduce you to Marcelo Barrera. He is an engineer and an MBA in energy management candidate at TU Berlin. He has more than 10 years of experience in the Chilean energy market in the private and public sectors. Marcelo is the founding partner and CEO at NG Fern Consulting. And before moving to Berlin, he worked as senior regulation engineer at NG, as lead project manager at the National Energy Commission, and as planning engineer in Transelec, one of the country's largest transmission companies. So thank you, Marcelo, for being here today, and we're all ears.
Thanks, Camila. I will start sharing my screen. All correct with the audio or not? Okay. Can you confirm if you can see the screen? Okay, the presentation? Okay. Okay, thanks, Camila. Thanks for the invitation, first for the Berkeley Global Society for this opportunity to share with you our experience, talk about energy markets, regulations. My presentation is related to the transmission market in Chile from the long-term point of view and the investment expected in this market. Additionally, I will present about potential risks and some feasible solutions I have identified. So my presentation is divided in 4 main points. The first one is the investment in transmission Chilean market, but is a general approach about this market. The second point is the decarbonization challenge, and after that, some potential risks for investors, for potential investors, and feasible solutions. And finally, the conclusions. So I made this presentation trying to thinking in a new potential investor. I prepared this presentation. I made this question, which are the opportunities and risks in the Chilean transmission market for potential investors. I will try to answer this question along the presentation, okay? And the conclusion is try to answer in particular this question. Firstly, general approach about how is the market. This is necessary to present the main characteristic of the Chilean national electrical systems. As you can see on this slide, the characterization of the market, basically the transmission is a regulated market with a monopolistic characteristic, as Gabriela said. Currently, this is a grid with a length of more than 3,000 kilometers. It's a radial nature. There are three segments in this market: the national, the zonal, and the dedicated or private segment. Here I present the more important characteristic of this segment, but in this presentation we will focus mainly in the national transmission system. Okay, this system is one of the most important, is the most important transmission grid in the country, and the main purpose of this one is to create a common energy market and supply the total energy demand. Additionally, on that, it has a responsibility to interconnect other systems. It's important to keep in mind that the segmentation of the market. We can see in this picture that the segmentation, the size in total is investment value of the market is around $14,000 million. The national systems represent around almost 50%. In this slide, I present a more important event along the history and changes in terms of important reforms, how affect the transmission market. Okay, basically it changed from the market approach in the beginning, where the market was deregulated, to full centralized expansion planning led by the National Commission of Energy nowadays. From 1982 to 2004, the transmission planning was based in a market approach. It means that the new projects, for example, new power line, were based in a bilateral contract between generation companies, and only the one, at that time, one transmission company was Transelec. But after the main reforms happened in 2004, in this year, all the new projects, new infrastructure in the national system grid is made under a tender process led by the National Commission of Energy. The algorithm has the right to construct and operate the infrastructure with a fixed tariff for 20 years. For upgrades in the system, this is the responsibility to the owner of the assets. Until that time, Transelec was the main player in the national transmission market. Nowadays, there are another several firms that they have our important project. For instance, ISA, Interchile, is a the main Colombian transmission firm. Award the Cardones por Paico project in 2011, if I remember. But important, in this way, we have a lot of new companies in the market. As Camila said before in the presentation, in 2016, the transmission law reform was introduced. In terms of expansion planning, it keeps this approach, but the annual planning is analyze all the systems, national systems and zonal system as well. As you can imagine, the annual planning is even more demanding, a large process, and additionally on that, heavy administrative process every year. But what's happened in the last decade? In order to know this, these two graphs represent the evolution of investment in national transmission system in terms of investment value and the number of the project over the last 10 years. For instance, the year 2010 represents the investment value of all the new projects included in the annual planning. For example, in the time, Cardones por Paico project in 2010. The dark blue represents the new projects, and the light blue represents upgrades. Okay. I would like to point it out here that the investment value reaches the historical maximum in 2 years ago with the HVDC Kimalo Aguirre project. But the next year, 2019, we can see a big drop in investment in the annual planning. Which, thinking about this, which was the reason of this fall? Basically, under my perspective, it was due to the saturation of the market. I mean that the national transmission system is completely adapted to the demand, for example, and no more projects are required. On the other hand, in the right side, we can see that the number of upgrades for existing infrastructure increased in the last 3 years in this slope. I present in this slide a general information about the project, the biggest projects currently in a tender process. Has Camila said before, start in October, but the main characteristic of this project is, under my opinion, this innovative project because it's a big project with a length with 1,500 kilometers from Antofagasta, connect Antofagasta to Santiago. This is equivalent to connect Madrid with Frankfurt, Istanbul, Prague, or Beijing with Shanghai. Okay. The estimated cost of this project is more than $1,000 million. It represents around 20% of the national transmission market. Why is this necessary? It's one of the most important infrastructures for the decarbonization plan. This facilitates the introduction of renewable energy and foster the international future interconnection with Peru and Argentina, for example. I would like to point out here is that the bidding process has started, but in a preliminary phase. The second stage of this bidding process, the firms must prepare the offer in terms of technical, environmental, social, and economical aspects. The coordinator must review by these offers between August and October. And finally, is expected to start construction in December 2020, December the next year. In terms of the decarbonization challenge in Chile, but it's a presentation more related to the infrastructure needed to, electrical infrastructure needed to in coming years. Basically, we have 28 coal power plants in Chile, more than 5,000 megawatts that will shut down in the next few years. So here in the picture, you can see the distribution of these all coal power plants. These are located in the north, in the center, and the south of Chile. And this plan, Chile has the plan to reach the carbon neutrality in 2050, but nowadays is under discussion to shut down this old coal power plant in 5 years more. This is an alternative scenario, but this can be possible, I don't know. But it's also possible full decarbonization in 2030, for example. It's possible, is under discussion. And which opportunity does decarbonization bring to the transmission market? Obviously, it's necessary to introduce more infrastructure, reinforcement of the existing infrastructure. Now, here in this table shows a preliminary values about what is the amount of total investments in transmission in new projects the next few years. Here we can see that it's approximately $3,000 million in order to improve the grid, and obviously in the next one, sorry. Thinking about the potential risks identified for the investors and some feasible solutions, we discussed that today the expansion plan is more and more centralized than before, for example. It can bring risks because there are not clear signals for investors. For instance, there are operate project with a 2 years of construction time, but administrative process of the annual planning can take around more or less 3 years. For this reason, under my perspective, under my understanding, flexible annual planning can be a good solution. The idea is to create a fast track administrative procedure just for upgrade projects. This could be done for every month, for example. And the idea is try to speed up the administrative process. Okay. On the other hand, the new projects, for the new project, the environmental risks are completely under the responsibility of the investors. This can be a problem. Yes, this is a problem because the investor must evaluate all the risk of the environmental aspect and social as well, and the project cannot enter in the established dates. Penalties can be applied for the point of view of the systems, congestions of the grids, high marginal costs, security problems, and problems in supply and demand. It's possible to have this type of problems. And so from the point of view of investors, more risk is in the hand of them. And under my perspective, this could be bring less participation in the future tender process. For these reasons, one feasible solution could be it's necessary, I think, the introduction of the environmental and social impact of this type of project, or for example, HVDC or another big project in the future, in early or pre-project stage. For example, during these periods, study deeply what are the effects, what are the environmental problems, and not waiting to start the project and trust and the firms made all the studies about the environmental studies. The National Commission, the idea is try to study before, obviously, all the environmental aspects in this stage, I think. So in conclusion, and coming back to the main questions about the opportunities and risks for investors in Chilean markets, I can say yes, we have a lot of opportunities in the next few years because we said before that we expect that the decarbonization process will bring a lot of new infrastructure. On the other hand, investors must phase out more and more complicated social and environmental problems in the state of construction. So investors must have a clear view about the impact of the new project in the society. Gonzalo will speak more in detail about the experience about the environmental problems, what happened, for example, for Cardones por Paico. And the last conclusion under my perspective is the role of the annual planning is the key for the investment in transmission market. But I think that it must be adapted to the changing world. More flexible, more dynamic annual planning is required. And the idea is try to improve the regulation in this way. Sorry. So this was my presentation. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for your attention. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to contact me or text me. Thanks, Camila. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcelo. That was a great presentation. I think it's refreshing to have a pure business perspective and see how, from your lenses, how this regulation will impact, or you expect will impact or may impact the market. I just, again, as I said to Gabriela, also I appreciate that you present alternatives to solve some of the problems that you see are the most frequent for investors. I mean, the time of the processing and the administrative procedure that takes too long, right? And with this new technology, the HVDC line being incorporated to the grid, it probably makes sense, as you say, to be more flexible and adapt to reality and try to see what business people and companies are thinking behind regulations. So I appreciate the perspective. Again, as Marcelo said, please write down your questions in the chat. I think we're going to have a bit of time at the very end to address them all. And now I'm going to present Gonzalo. who is going to give us an environmental view on the subject in the transmission market. So let me introduce you to him. He's our final speaker, and Gonzalo Barot, he earned his LLM from UC Berkeley with a certificate in environmental law. He has more than 10 years of experience in environmental law and natural resources regulation. He currently works as an attorney for the National Environmental Enforcement Agency in Chile, and his division within the agency supervises environmental compliance of the most important energy transmission projects. So thank you for joining us, Gonzalo, and you're ready to go.
Thank you, Camila, so much for your kind presentation. Also, thank you, Berkeley Global Society, for inviting me to this panel. And also thank you to my fellow panel members and their very interesting presentations. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope this works. Are you seeing me now? The slides, are they visible? Great. Okay, so this panel is about innovation and challenges for regulation of the power markets. And my presentation is going to speak about the challenges of the energy regulation, and more specifically about the transmission segment of the energy markets. My main topic will be sustainability in the planning stages of transmission infrastructure. Okay, so I work in the Environmental Enforcement Agency, or Superintendencia del Medio Ambiente, so I need to do some disclaimers. First, I'm going to talk about two cases, and I can't really discuss any factual or legal aspects of the cases any more than is already in the public domain. And also, as a worker in the Environmental Enforcement Agency, I am not specialized in energy regulation, but rather in environmental law. So I will attempt to analyze what is going on with environmental compliance of transmission projects and try to explain a bit of a regulation problem that exceeds the functions of the environmental authority. So first of all, contents of this presentation. First, I'm going to give an overview of the Chilean transmission planning and siting rules. Then I'm going to talk about environmental assessment and enforcement. Then we are going to go over some lessons from two transmission projects, and then some final thoughts. Okay, so first of all, this has already been mentioned by Marcelo and other speakers today. So basically, I'll just go quickly over this point. My attempt here is to make a two-step proposal. First, we see that there's a rush in the energy markets to reach a power grid that is both green and reliable. And in order to get there, we need a strong transmission infrastructure. So the goal to curb greenhouse gas emissions is a priority, and that is great. However, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is not the only environmental aspect we need to consider. We need to establish strong environmental values all throughout the process. And the second aspect of my proposal is that there are aspects of environmental protection, sustainability, and respect for human rights that are very difficult to address from a standpoint of environmental assessment and enforcement alone. We need to remember that along with climate change, we're facing a devastating biodiversity crisis and also civil unrest, both of which require that the public and private sectors consider environmental factors early on. These are complementary objectives. Actually, the UN established that 1/3 of the net reductions that are necessary to reach the Paris Agreement could come from nature-based solutions. So the cost of overcommitting to one goal and delaying the other is too high. And also we need to remember that the Chilean legal system is facing an upcoming constitutional convention, and the subject seems to be very relevant in this context. Okay, so the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, this is a UN report from August of this year. No news there. Basically, the main pressures driving biodiversity loss are still increasing. The risk of extinction increases across taxonomic groups, and you have species populations in decline. So we're not doing good in when we speak about biological diversity. The Aichi biodiversity targets were established in 2010. Here are some examples. According to these targets, we were supposed to be integrating biodiversity in the planning stages by 2020, and the rate of loss of all natural habitats has to be greatly reduced. Now the UN reports that the world has failed to meet any of the Aichi targets. The next COP will take place on May 2021, and the objective of that reunion will be to set a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thus, sustainability, environmental protection, and respect for human rights cannot be isolated from project development and need to be considered from the very early planning stages. So as we will see in this presentation, even when public departments and agencies have the tools to integrate these values in planning, the pressure to reach other objectives, such as having a strong transmission grid in order for having a greener power grid, may be a powerful incentive to skip these tools. This makes up for quite a contradiction that we need to overcome. Okay, so to go very quickly over what is transmission planning. Okay, so we know it's part of the 2016 reform, and it takes place in the context of energetic planning, and the National Energy Commission makes a proposal every year with a 20-year horizon that includes necessary expansion works and development notes. So the planning process takes place basically by the coordinator sending a consolidated expansion plan to the commission. Then the commission submits a final technical report to the Department of Energy, which finally defines line routes for certain transmission projects. And some of them will go straight to the tender process, and others will go to a line siting study. So what is a line siting study? It is a process by which the Department of Energy establishes location alternatives that best combine project development with environmental, social, and economic aspects of the territories. Once it's finished, the Department of Energy submits one alternative to a Council of Secretaries for Sustainability, which is basically a reunion of the highest government authorities. And later on, the bidder, once he's awarded with the project, will be required to respect the defined corridor. The two main objectives of this study are to reach sustainability based on a strategic territorial convention, and also to obtain social legitimacy and risk contention. The study is based on a methodology that was prepared by Electric Power Research Institute and the Georgia Transmission Corporation, all of these in the United States, and considers a multi-criteria assessment based on the different elements that are present in the territories and how they are valued by society and relevant stakeholders that may affect project development. And all of this data is fed into a geographic information system. While the study is conducted, there's also a need to implement strategic impact assessment, to integrate environmental and sustainability factors while defining the route. And this involves also public participation. So the study begins on a broader preliminary area where screening and systematization process begins to narrow the possible corridors. Then the more defined territorial information, as well as the input that comes from the strategic assessment and also from the public participation, are all fed to this model. And the result will be a number of alternative choices of transmission routes that from which the Department of Energy needs to pick one and propose it to the council. The definitive line location is not entirely set. The project then is submitted to a tender process, and the exact location for the construction of the different parts of the project is not set, and it may vary. The exact line location will be defined when the project then enters environmental assessment. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about environmental assessment, which will be the next step of this process. Under Chilean law, certain projects that meet certain criteria require environmental assessment before they can be executed. The project license sets some conditions and measures that need to be complied with. High transmission lines over 23 kilovolts enter the system, and if they generate significant impacts on public health or environmental components, such as social systems, they need to perform an environmental impact study. After the assessment process is done, the project is granted with a license, an RCA, that sets some requirements and measures, and environmental enforcement is about making sure that those requirements are met. Also, in parallel with this system, we have environmental trials that seek reparation for environmental damages and may end up with compensation for the affected parties. Okay, so this is the existing system for environmental enforcement, and here are some challenges that we are facing when we deal with siting problems. So the environmental enforcement deals with license compliance and can impose penalties up to $7.5 million for each verified offense. We can also revoke licenses, and foreclosure of the establishments is another possibility. The enforcement may come from citizen reports, but the agency can only take action when the license terms are breached, and this may be a very technical determination. Also, when we charge a corporation with non-compliance, the company can submit a compliance program that may fix the issues within a certain time lapse. If the program then is executed in a correct manner, then there are no penalties required. Therefore, the limitations of environmental enforcement are basically set by the boundaries of project assessment and licensing. Siting issues and environmental conflicts sometimes exceed these boundaries and are very difficult to solve. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I'm going to talk about two projects. First of all, Cardones Polpaico. This is a transmission project. Okay, we've talked about this project throughout this panel, but it basically is a transmission project located in the northern regions of Chile, and the project is already commissioned and facing environmental enforcement action. First, we have an enforcement process of 2018. It was originally about two offenses, noise monitoring and exceeding the noise quality standard. New inspections and citizen reports made the agency file new charges very recently. It was determined that the noise monitoring didn't account for the corona discharge. That is a technical problem that the high transmission lines have and generate some noise. So basically, the monitoring wasn't done in the proper conditions to take into account this corona discharge. And thus, we have two serious offenses that are still under investigation. Then we have also an environmental trial. In 2020, Agrícola La Dormida sued the project owner for environmental damages, and this is related with the affectation of native forest and also the protected northern acorn, and is also related with the excessive noise provoked by unauthorized helicopter flights. And finally, we have a new enforcement process of 2020 related with the use of strips of land that are not approved in the project license, which affected several acres of native forests. There was an inadequate forest and vegetation management and habitat intervention of northern acorns. Also, we have unauthorized heliports and camps, solid waste management, and light pollution charges. One very serious offense in this procedure is the intervention of approximately 12 acres of northern acorn, that is a species that cannot be intervened under Chilean law. There are 4 serious offenses, one of which consists of native forest intervention with 308 acres of unauthorized intervention, 71 of which are of protected vegetational formations, and we have 4 less serious offenses, so a total of 9 charges in this new enforcement action. The process is also under investigation and pending definition. So we have 2 sets of offenses. On one hand, we have biodiversity-related offenses, and on the, in that regard, it's important to consider that the project goes through biosphere reserve that is declared by UNESCO in 1984, and another set of offenses that seem to be related to vicinity, as the noise standards are being exceeded. They're using helicopters, and we have this problem with the corona discharge. So both sets of offenses relate with an underlying environmental conflict. As we can see in the picture, inhabitants of La Dormida climbed the towers to protest against the project being constructed and so on. So, that is about Cardones Polpaico, and now I'm going to talk about another project that is Quimaldo Aguirre. Okay, so this project has been referred to extensively by Marcelo, another transmission line in the northern regions, and here we go back to the line siting study. And this is an aspect we didn't discuss earlier. When is it required that we perform a line siting study? So the reform gave some criteria, and this has been complemented by the ruling 139 of 2017 that provides additional criteria. It basically is related with tension levels, proposed destination, access difficulties, implementation complexities, magnitude of the words, and so on. So what happened with the planning stages of Quimaldo Aguirre? Initially, it was considered in the expansion of the transmission lines, and it was determined that there was a high degree of socio-environmental complexity, high presence of urban and rural settlements. We have a high technical complexity, 932 miles of transmission lines with a high voltage direct current with 2,000 megawatts of transmission capacity. So initially, the Executive Order 231 of 2019 said, okay, we have to perform a line siting study for Quimaldo Aguirre. However, the Executive Order 163 of 2020 streamlines the project and determines that it will be exempt of the line siting study. What are the arguments for this? I'm going to go over them very briefly. Okay, so the Executive Order says that the line siting study will take no less than 18 months, and that it hadn't even begun a preliminary definition, so it was very delayed. The executive order goes on about the importance of the transmission line for the solar generation in northern regions. The need for additional transmission capacity has been noted even since Cardones Polpaico was being built. And the idea is that direct current will complement the alternated current technology that already exists, and that will maximize potency and avoid congestion. And the thing here that is very repeated in the executive order is the decommissioning of coal-powered plants that has accelerated the need to integrate the renewable sources. The National Energy Coordinator actually said that even without the decommissioning, once the project is commissioned on 2030, Quimaldo Aguirre will absorb all of the 2,000 megawatts capacity instantly. So over that, we need to add the decommissioning of coal-based power that will take place probably around 2030. Both the National Energy Commission and the coordinator sent classified reports, and they talked about the system operation costs and the benefits of streamlining the project. The coordinator also speaks about additional carbon dioxide emissions that will take place if the project is delayed. And the commission, on the other hand, says that there's evidence that to have extra transmission capacity will actually boost renewable technologies on the northern region. It is also said that direct current technologies require a smaller exclusion zone for the power lines, and the consequential reduction of the project surface will reduce potential conflicts, thus making the line siting study untimely and ungrounded. And finally, it is said that the Secretary of Energy cannot only consider these criteria, but also the requirements of the national power system. And also the pandemic is mentioned, of course. There are health concerns regarding the execution of the study, and also thinking ahead of the problems that it will cause for the national system to have transmission problems. So it seems that the executive order is very weighted towards the national interest criteria, and it seems to override the sustainability-based criteria to determine whether the project requires a line siting study. So finally, the tender process is already open, as Marcelo said, and it started in October, and it's currently waiting for technical proposals. So what are my thoughts on this two projects we went through? Very quickly. So Cardenas Pike on one hand shows the limitations of the environmental authorities, which can only go so far to address environmental conflict and human rights protections. And there are some problems that are very difficult for us to fix. On the other hand, for Quimaldo Aguirre, there are good news. This is a definitive endorsement from the Chilean government to this project. But on the other hand, it demonstrates that the pressure to go quickly to a greener economy may lead us to take less sustainable choices, which is quite a contradiction. So my suggestion to private utilities, on one hand, is to integrate core sustainability and environmental values from the very early stages. Also go beyond basic siting and create a durable relation with stakeholders on the grounds of mutual understanding. And for future endeavors, also be very wary on the planification stages and try to make pressure on the government authorities so the timelines are met and there's no delay in the planification process. Regarding regulation in the public sector, on the other hand, thinking ahead, planning and strategic environmental assessment should not be so attached to discretionary criteria. We need to close the gaps of discretionary authority when it comes to environmental values on early planning stages. And we need to further regulate the criteria and standards of environmental protection within the planning stages. And finally, we must not forget we are facing a multifactorial environmental crisis, which includes not only climate change, but also biodiversity loss. Both public and private sectors need to take this matter very seriously. And it is fundamental that we overcome this trade-off between, on one hand, give streamlined permits to reach a green power grid, and on the other hand, stop integrating values in the core of public planning. The government must assume a relevant degree of the project risk by developing necessary preliminary studies, which will improve the incentives for all the actors in the process. Okay, so that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. That was a great presentation. I couldn't agree more with your conclusions. It's kind of crazy to see these tensions between moving to a greener energy system, but at the same time sacrificing other environmental values just to hurry on those projects. So I really appreciate your perspective on that. And for certain, it is really important for investment, right? And for the market. I mean, there are things that investors have to bear in mind before making decisions. So thank you for giving us that perspective today. I think that we have some questions in the chat. I think that we can take some time, maybe 10 minutes, or 15 minutes to try to answer them. Let's go. Let's see. There's one for Marcelo and Gonzalo, and other ones for the first block for Fernanda and Gabriela. So I'll start. I'll go back to distribution now. Okay, here is a question for both Fernanda and Gabriela. And it says, going back to the antitrust issues raised in the two first presentations, do you think that integration between retailers and distribution companies should be total or only partial? What has been the experience in reference markets, and what would you recommend? I don't know which of you wants to start.
I could start if that's okay with Fernanda. Actually, I was thinking that this question might arise, so I have an additional slide that I want to share with you to answer it. So here in this slide, you can see that we have a wide amount of possibilities in terms of restraining or establishing some limits to industrial structure in the law. So here you can see that in one extreme, in the left side, we have the idea of permanent legal restraint. That's the thing that's actually now happening with Article 7. and then we could have no restraint and just in the other side, we could have no restraint and just leave everything to competition law. I think that in the distribution market and the retail electricity market, there are like really good signals that might show that the competition advantages that the distribution company, the utility, has over other companies that don't own the network are really high. So I think there is actually a good reason to put a legal restraint, but I will never make the same mistake that the regulator did with Article 7, that in my opinion is really bad, to leave a market regulation that it's per se dynamic to a static restraint in the law. So I think that considering the risks that are involved, we should have a legal restraint, but it should be flexible, and we should have the capacity and for the authorities, the competition authorities, to revise that limit according on the evolution and development of the market. So I would stay in the blue square for this question.
Complementing what Gabriela mentioned, I think the question also addressed like the reference market topic, and at least in the European Union, there is a strict legal unbundled provision. The European Union, at least since mid-1990s, incorporate all kind of unbundling provisions that over time became gradually stricter. They passed from functional unbundling in the late 1990s to ownership unbundle I think in the third energy package that was published in 2009. So then, at least in Europe, they have a prohibition to have participation for transmission companies, both in generation and in supply. But at least there's a difference there, because the central concept is the concept of control. So transmission companies cannot have control in generation and supply companies. So it's mostly referred to voting rights or the right to appoint members of the directors or CEOs and etc. So maybe that's some kind of middle solution that is not that strict as the Article 7 that we have in Chile now.
Great, thank you.
And Camille,
now,
may I
sorry,
add something really
of
short?
Course.
Also,
sure.
like another thing that we have in Chile that I think it's really good to protecting competition is the merger control system. But the thing is that with an opening market, one that doesn't exist, the merger control system won't apply, because there won't be acquisitions for existing companies. All will be organic development. And in this organic development is where the utilities have the most advantage for the things I said while I was presenting. So that's why I think at least in the first years, while the market develops, this restriction should be at least for example, 30% of the market could be captured by the utilities, but none more than that. Because if we see what happened when the first liberalization started, there was like this segment of clients that could choose their own supplier. The ones between 500 and 5,000 kilowatts could choose. And when that happened, the utility that was in the concession zone at that time acquired almost 70% of the market in the first years. So these first years of development are really important, and we should take care of having the possibilities for new actors to enter the market. And if the utilities have this really strong competitive position, that won't be possible, and that's why I think it should be limited, at least temporarily.
Just to complete the idea, I would like to say that within, like as Gabriela mentioned, within this total prohibition that we have now in Article 7, there's a lot of middle positions that we have to take, that we can take. For example, as I mentioned, the legal ownership is the default. The legal ownership and bundle is the default option in Europe right now, but they also have some intermediate solutions such as independent system operators, where they can, another subsidiary company can have the real control of the TSO, or for example, they can have like a kind of separate administration within the different companies. So there's like many and plenty of options to analyze and to assess to change the Article 7.
I love it. let's keep the debate going. Thanks for your answers. Okay, so let's go back to the transmission, guys, here. So this is a question for Marcelo and Gonzalo, but it's divided in two. So the first one is, how is the competitiveness of Quimal Loaguirre project affected without a previous siting study? And the second one, I'm gonna shoot it right away, is which would you say is the best way to minimize the environmental and social risk for new electrical infrastructure projects in the future? I don't know if both of you want to address those or just like keep the debate flowing as Gabriela and
I can start.
Yeah, maybe Marcelo can go ahead and start. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. I would like to start with the second part of the questions. My opinion, the best way to try to minimize the environmental and social risks for any future infrastructure project in the future is try to change our mentality about we evaluate, we create in a planning project, a specific project for infrastructure, and then we prepare all the environmental and social impact. This is we need to change this way how to planning because under my opinion, it's necessary is create corridors, specific corridors, maybe with environmental studies, environmental impact of the society, and then this data is the data entry for the planning expansion, and then make the exercise of the planning expansion. This is an idea about under my opinion, because on the other side, all the risk is for the investors. In this, and answering this, the first part of the questions, in this, talking about the HVDC project, the competitiveness is, I think, it's not a really big problem because the project itself is a really big, it's a very interesting for future investors. It's a high technology project. It's a large technology, but I think that, for example, Transelec had the same problem in the Nogales Polpaico area with the Nogales Polpaico project in 2008. Afterwards, Celeo Redes had the same problem, environmental problems with the project Cancó Alto Jahuel. Finally, ISA, the main transmission company in Colombia, had the same problem with the same area. So we are doing the same after and after and after, and the regulatory is not changing. This is my opinion. Maybe Gonzalo can complement in another ideas about this.
Thank you, Marcelo. So basically, regarding the first question, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I don't know if it will affect the competitive standards of the project. I think, as Marcelo said, it probably won't. I mean, it's probable that it's less competitive, but it won't really stifle the whole project because of what happened with the planning stages. As Marcelo said, it's a very big project. It already has lots of interested parties, so I think it will be okay in that sense. And with the second question, I have we can think about government and regulation part of the equation, and we can think about the private actors that are involved in this. So I already talked a little bit about this in the presentation. I think that it's important regulation integrates the environmental standards and values on the planning stages, and that will allow us to prevent a lot of the problems we're seeing. So it's even more important than the tools that we have on the environmental enforcement aspects of project development. It's important that they are conceived on the very early stages as in a way that they won't affect as much both communities and environmental components. And for the project holders, I think it's important that two things. First, that they have a very early relationship with stakeholders, and they have a very close relationship, and they can actually supervise and see what's going on with the communities that may be affected by their projects. There was a project to actually bring early participation in the environmental assessment of the projects that actually will not take place. The bill, I think, was that part of the bill was cut off. So, but it's advisable that this early participation takes place before the project is submitted to environmental assessment, because once that happens, it's very difficult to change certain aspects of the project. It's important to have a project that is already defined with this information. And secondly, that during the environmental assessment, it is important that the project is really integrated with its environmental measures. Sometimes it happens that projects are assessed by a different consulting company that basically just commits a number of measures, and it doesn't really come into the project engineering. And it's important that this is really integrated, so the project has an environmental perspective that is always and continuously retrofitting the whole development process. Those would be my recommendations regarding the second question.
Thank you, guys. I'm glad you are in the environmental authority. Masada, you should start regulating and not only enforcing. Yeah, I think you both touched on very important points. And yeah, I think we're kind of on time. So I don't know if you wanna, we have a third question, but it's only for Fernanda. Fernanda, I don't know if you had the chance to read it. Do you wanna answer it? Maybe if you can do it in 5 minutes, so we can be respectful of everyone's time. I can read it out loud to you. Do you think this reform, the distribution reform, presents a real opportunity for new players to enter these new markets? If not, what would be needed?
I think that's a tricky question, and maybe Gabriela can also help me with that, with the answer. But the regulatory authority already said that probably most of the details of the licensing regime, that it would be really important to determine which actors can intervene in this retailing energy market. So the details that are going to be established in these administrative acts probably are going to tell more about the kind of players that can enter to that market. And by the other hand, we have like the emerging market trends that I already mentioned, that we can see that they're like major incumbents in the electricity sector or in the energy sector in general are already participating in these new markets that are opening up around the distribution network. So maybe these are going to be the new players. And like in other markets, like in international market, there's like even like retailers, like proper retailer, like, I don't know, Falabella intervening in retail energy markets, or telecommunications companies becoming retailing energy markets. So maybe, I don't know. I think it's a difficult question, and maybe Gabriela can help me with that.
I fully agree with your answer, Fernanda. I would just add like a little thing that competition is never a sure thing, but what we can do is create the environment to allow competition to grow. So considering that, I think that there are some structural things that should be in the bill that I hope that will be incorporated during the discussion of the House of Representatives. Hopefully some things that we were talking after, like in the question before, about the structure and the ability of the utility to participate in these markets, but also and regarding the licensing process that you were mentioning, I think it's really important that even though the licenses are designed and will be think about as something to protect the customers and to protect the market and give guarantees that everything will function in a smooth way, we also must be aware that this licensing process will create a barrier to entry for the markets. So in designing this instrument, the people who are designing them must be aware that there must be a really hard balance between protecting the market and protecting the final consumers and protecting the chain of payments and everything that happens among the electricity market. But we can't forget that this will be a barrier to entry. So they must be mitigated considering this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your answers. I think there's so many interesting topics. I mean, it's two huge worlds, right? So we could be talking about this forever. But I think we are on time, and I want to be respectful of your time and the attendees' time. Just want to thank you all for all the energy that you put into this panel, for bringing your expertise to share it with the audience, and all these like innovative regulations that a lot of us don't know much about it. So I think we all learned a lot. And just want to thank also Berkeley Global Society for this space. Tell the attendees and people that maybe couldn't connect today that the recording of this panel will be available in YouTube and probably in LinkedIn too. So, and also to the attendees that didn't have the chance to ask questions or wanna like go farther into details into some of the topics, you can reach our speakers through LinkedIn. The Berkeley Global Society website have all the details there. And I think that's it. Thank you for this great conversation and for your time, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Camila.
I'm gonna end this now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.